Thanks everyone for coming back early and for cutting your break short. Now and it would be worth it for our next speaker. So Rachel Botsman wrote the book, What's Mine is Yours. And in that she explained the theory of collaborative consumption, a theory that Time magazine called an idea that will change the world. But she hasn't sat back and waited for it to change the world. Although she's based in Sydney, been traveling around the world, being quoted in publications such as the Harvard Business Review, The Economist, and been called by Fast Company as one of the most creative people in business. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rachel Botsman.
I hate stairs as you come on the stage. Thank you for having me this morning. I'm really excited to talk to you about a subject that I have been studying and writing about for the last 7 years, the collaborative economy, which some people call the sharing economy. And what I want to do this morning is really focus on two things. The first is to give you a very simple way of understanding the disruption that is happening. And then what I really want to focus on is how the change isn't about the technology, but is a massive transformation in the way we think about trust. So just to give me a feel for everyone in the room, I think my slides are going to come up. I'd like you to raise your hands, if we could just go back, thank you. Raise your hands if you are a host or a guest on Airbnb. Wow, that's amazing. So about 60–70% of the room. Is anyone a borrower or a lender on Society One? 0, easy to count. And has anyone posted errands on Airtasker? Wow, that's amazing. So there's about 50 people. And who uses Uber? Okay, it's an Uber crowd. So what I'm going to do is explain how all these ideas are connected by the idea of the collaborative economy. But before I go to the future, I want to take a step back. And I want to tell you the story of the company that really was the inspiration for me to explore this idea, and you could think of as the godfather of the collaborative economy, and that is eBay. So some of you may have heard the rumor that eBay was started to help Pierre Omidyar, the founder, help his girlfriend at the time buy and sell Pez dispensers that she collected. Now, for any of you that don't know what Pez dispensers are, they're those funny things where candy shoots out the mouth that you often collect as a kid. This, in fact, is a complete myth. And it was made up by the marketing department of eBay because the true story is too geeky. So the true story that I discovered when I was researching my book is that Pierre Omidyar, as a test, decided to put this broken laser pointer up for auction on his website. And the reason why he decided to do it as a test was he wanted to see if there was anyone in the world who would bid on a broken laser pointer. Now, even he was surprised that within 24 hours, he received a bid for $11.83. So he wrote to the bidder and he said, "You do realize that this laser pointer is broken?" And the person wrote back and said, "I'm a collector of broken laser pointers." This is a dead true story. Now, this for me, when I heard this, was a real light bulb in my head, because what I realized was that we were in the nascent stages of seeing technology do two things. The first is that technology creates the efficiency to match millions of haves with millions of wants in ways on a scale that have never been possible before. And what that's doing is transforming the way we think about supply and demand and transforming the relationship between producers and people that were formerly consumers. But the piece that really interests me and that we started to see in eBay is this notion of trust. How technology creates a new kind of social glue, this trust to form between strangers that is dramatically transforming the relationship people expect between companies, between borrowers and lenders, between producers and consumers. And that's what we're really going to explore today. So it's these two ingredients of efficiency and trust that sit underneath thousands of examples that you're seeing that are emerging around the world. And they're all part of this collaborative economy. Now, the way I define this through an economic lens is basically you're taking these decentralized platforms of marketplaces and networks, you're taking underused assets, Now, these assets could be laser pointers, they could be empty seats in cars, they could be empty rooms in people's homes, they could be skills, they could be money. And you make that liquid by matching needs and haves in ways that bypass traditional organizations. Now, what sits underneath this is this massive shift that is very threatening to many traditional incumbents. Because what we're just starting to see is how we're moving from an age, an industrial economy, where we built these top-down, hierarchical, centralized institutions. Institutions that could control the creation, production, and distribution of goods. And what we're moving to is this world of distributed, connected communities. And the reason why this is really interesting through a brand and marketing lens is it completely changes the way not only people find products and services and the way products and services are made, but the perception and reputation around brands. So just to give you a little bit of history, sometimes people ask me, how on earth did you start thinking about this? I started thinking about it in 2008. I was working for President Clinton at the time. It was a very strange connection. And I sort of became obsessed with how ideas like eBay and Zipcar and Craigslist and Airbnb were connected. I also believed that the sharing that we were starting to see through social media, so the sharing of photos, the sharing of videos, the sharing of silly cats, was just the start of a new behavior. A new behavior where people were becoming more comfortable to share and collaborate through technology. So I decided to write a book. The book was a total flop. Anyone who is thinking of writing a book, it can be an incredibly disheartening experience. My book sold a grand total of 12 copies in the first week. And my grandma told me that she bought 6 on Amazon, so I actually sold 6 copies. But the point is that it can be very lonely when ideas are just starting to emerge, and it took a lot of convincing, but 5 years later, The Economist basically declared that it's time to start caring about sharing. And the numbers really prove that this is a massive thing. So last year alone, around $15 billion was invested in startups in this space. The average amount of money that a startup received in Series A funding was over $45 million, and that excludes Airbnb and Uber. So what I want to do today is people often say to me, how do you understand the disruption? And what I've seen is that the best way to understand it is actually to think differently about value, to change your lens on value, and to ask these 3 questions. How is value created? How is value scaled? And how is value trusted differently? So how is this space fundamentally changing these 3 business questions? So let's look at this first question of how value is created. Now, I'm going to share with you the story of Airbnb because it is kind of the poster child now of this idea. This is Brian, Joe, and Nate when I met them in 2007. And this is Brian, Joe, and Nate in 2014 after they just heard that their company was worth $10 billion. Now, this slide here represents one of the worst decisions of my life. Now, the reason why it represents one of the worst decisions of my life was because I decided to listen to my husband and not to invest in this company. Now, what happened was I started researching this space, and I went to go and visit the guys. They were living in Rouse Street, and they told me the story that you've probably heard, that this big conference came into town. All the hotels were sold out. So Brian decided to go and just buy these blow-up mattresses and rent them on the conference website. Now, it had since started to grow a little bit, and I came back and I told my husband about this, and I said, this is the next eBay. And he said, this is a terrible idea. And the reason why he said this was a terrible idea, to be fair to him, was he said, who wants to sleep on those mattresses? Mistake 1, because we often judge ideas for what they are today and not what they'll become in the future. So it's really difficult often to see ideas when they emerge and see how they'll move up the value spectrum. The second thing he said was that this is an eBay, because strangers will never trust one another. People will not trust one another to rent out their homes. And this is what fascinates me, is that we talk about change, but we're actually in this accelerated period of transformation of trust. So, as many of you know, those who use Airbnb, it is a marketplace that matches people looking for places to rent with people who are looking for places to stay. And the beauty of the Airbnb is that you can find things like spare rooms and holiday homes, but you can also find tree houses. So there's over 750 tree houses now on Airbnb, igloos, airplane hangars. This is a teepee I stayed in San Francisco where the owners make $25,000 a year renting out this luxury teepee. Now, the genius behind the guys of Airbnb was they were one of the first entrepreneurs to realize that to build a really innovative company, they had to go out and find assets like these. That holiday homes and spare rooms, they had idling capacity, but that what we could do now with this really interesting intersection of social, mobile, and location technologies is create a market for things that never had a marketplace before. That you could take assets like teepees and igloos and make them liquid through these networks and marketplaces. And the growth is truly staggering. So Airbnb is now the second highest valued hospitality brand in the world, just after Hilton Hotels, above Marriott now. It's around $25 billion. And the reason for that is if you compare these two pictures, so if you compare a traditional incumbent like Hilton, it took them over 93 years to build a portfolio of over 610,000 rooms. Airbnb have now over 1 million rooms, and they're adding over 40,000 properties to their inventory every single month. So this brings me to the next question, because what Airbnb are disrupting is how value scales. So how value is created, they're basically figuring out that there's all these existing assets that you can make liquid through a marketplace, and then they have a highly scalable model. And the reason for this is because many companies, many of these top-down centralized companies, they're what we would call asset-heavy companies. And what we're seeing today is the emergence of these asset-light companies. Companies that don't own any inventory, for now they don't employ many people, and what they do is they facilitate access to this inventory that already exists. Let me jump to a completely different area of our lives to show how wide this can apply. So I'm going to go to one of my pet peeves, which is parking. Now, don't ask me why, I decided to research parking. And I discovered that we will waste, if we live in an urban area, 103 days of our lives looking for parking. Parking causes 30% of traffic in urban areas. And the reason why is because we have too many cars on the road and a shortage of parking spaces. So you can guess there were some brilliant entrepreneurs that recognized there was an opportunity. Take the same principle of Airbnb and apply it to parking. Now, the reason why this platform is a really good example is what we're starting to see happen is a mixture of peer-to-peer, so individuals who own driveways and putting them in the marketplace, but the big opportunity is actually B2B that then goes into the marketplace. So they've actually gone to private garages, they've gone to hotels, and found this really interesting mixture of commercial and private supply and built a marketplace around it. But it doesn't stop there. Because you guys are marketers, right? Like, no one's thinking as they're driving around, oh, I can now use Just Park to find parking. It's such a big leap in behavior. So what they've done is really smart. They've put it in the path of an existing behavior. So they've partnered with BMW, and it was really interesting, actually, how this partnership came about. So some of you have probably heard that BMW are making a really big play in car sharing. And BMW are asking themselves a really important question, which is how can we create new value in our customers' lives? How can we play a different role in our customers' lives? So they formed this partnership with Just Park, and the marketplace now sits in the steering wheel. So I'm going to show you a quick video that shows two users testing Just Park for the first time.
To test out Just Park, we turned it on our smartphone, connected it to the car, and Just Park appeared as a function on the dashboard. It shows you parking spots in the neighborhood, from people who are renting space to private driveways and space behind churches and pubs. The driver books and pays for a spot, and then the car's GPS navigation system takes you there. Brilliant.
Well, there we are. So the owner of this spot has just made about £6.
£6, I think.
So what you see happening there is where we're seeing sort of the sharing economy meet on-demand gratification, instant gratification, where you can use these marketplaces to instantly enable people to find these parking spaces that weren't available. And Just Park is exactly like Airbnb. It can scale really fast because it's operating through technology in this asset-light model. Now, of course, this is exactly the same principle behind Uber. Now, Uber is a fascinating company, and you could literally spend the whole day studying how it's a brilliant illustration of so many different forms of disruption, whether that's payment, simplicity, choice of offerings. But the same thing is happening. They're basically not owning the taxis, they're not employing the drivers, they're working on this asset-light model. And we hear about the evaluation of $41.2 billion, but it's incredible when you think about it that it's now one of the 150 most valuable companies in the world. It's more valuable than FedEx or Delta Airlines, this 6-year-old startup. And I was recently back in San Francisco, and I discovered that it's actually taken 2/3 of the taxi industry's business in the last 3 years. So if you're in the taxi industry, you're kind of asking yourself, are you having your Kodak moment? And the really interesting thing to me is that when you talk to the taxi industry, they don't really see the business model disruption, but they also don't see the consumer change. That the consumer has realized that there is a new way to get around, and you can't put that genie back in the bottle. So what's happening is fascinating. This is Tom Goodwin. He recently wrote a post about this phenomenon. He's from Havas Media, and he put it so well. He said, Uber, the world's largest taxi company, owns no vehicles. Facebook, the world's most popular media owner, creates no content. Alibaba, the most valuable retailer, has no inventory. And Airbnb, the world's largest accommodation provider, owns no real estate. Something interesting is happening here. Now, the interesting thing that many people are pointing to is this new model of value creation and how we scale value. But I think the more profound change is around trust. Because if you think about all these examples, they require a different interaction. They require a different degree of trust. So the last question I want to explore is, how is value trusted? How is the way we make decisions around which products and service to use fundamentally changing? So it's really interesting. I've done a little bit of work with the hospitality industry, and TripAdvisor freaks them out. Like, this is sort of their worst nightmare, that all these people can actually rate and provide feedback on their genuine experiences. Now, what's interesting is, you think about TripAdvisor, it's still actually pretty old world. Because on TripAdvisor, you still have guests rating companies. You still have customers rating companies. And that's the dynamic that we're used to. But what we see happening in the collaborative economy is that companies are starting to rate customers. Because the reason why is that this all depends on one fundamental question. When you take that UberX driver, when you stay on Airbnb, you have to ask, can I trust this person? So what we're seeing emerging, and we are just in the nascent stages of understanding, are these two-way rating systems. Rating systems where providers rate customers and customers rate providers. Now, I experienced how dangerous this is from my own personal experience of using Uber. So I was in San Francisco, and my dad came to help me with my 2 young children. And as many of you know, San Francisco is very hard to get around. It's not a great taxi system. So I gave him my phone, and I said, here is Uber, and here is Lyft, the 2 competitors. Press the button, and a car will show up. Now, this was very dangerous because the money was removed. He spent an absolute fortune. But the point was, when I got back to Sydney, I discovered that drivers wouldn't pick me up anymore. And the reason why drivers wouldn't pick me up anymore was that my passenger score was now a 3. And the reason why my passenger score was a 3 was because my dad admitted he'd cancelled a few, he'd been in the wrong spot, my son Jack threw up in the car and he didn't clean it up, Gracie was screaming one day. He has damaged my reputation. And I thought it was amazing because I called Uber and I was trying to fix this problem, and they said, you've actually committed reputation fraud. And The woman who advocates reputation capital has committed reputation fraud. But this is a really interesting conversation to even be having with a company. We wouldn't have been having this conversation 2 to 3 years ago. So what's happening is we now need the information to decide how to trust individuals and not just institutions. And this fundamentally changes the information that we have to present to people and how we manage that information. It is an absolute nightmare in terms of data and privacy and security. But the other interesting thing that we're starting to see emerge is how this dynamic actually changes human behavior. So this is a photo of my own towel behavior in hotels. It's a confession. I was at the Disney Florida Swan something or other, and the shower leaked, and I just chucked all the towels on the floor. And as I was walking out, I had this moment where I said, I would never do this in an Airbnb place. And the reason why I would never do this in an Airbnb place is because of these friggin' ratings, right? I know that I'm gonna be rated as a guest, and the first thing that would be in my top line was she left 7 towels on the floor. Now, this is so interesting, right, that these devices, these trust mechanisms that we're just starting to understand can actually change human behavior. They can change the relationship between the people providing the services and the people consuming the services. So we're starting to see how trust is becoming this new currency. That trust between strangers, I think, is going to be the currency of the 21st century. But where this also gets really interesting is how people are starting to realize that the reputation they're building up on these platforms has value. So in the profile that I just showed you of Kate, she's been a host. I don't think I can go, thanks. She's been a host on Airbnb for 5 years. She went to go and live in New York. She couldn't get a rental agreement because she had no history there. She printed off pages of Airbnb reviews. And she tweeted this, which I thought was really interesting, said, just got approved for a 12-month rental lease, largely on the basis of my positive Airbnb reviews. Welcome to the future. Now, this is people like Kate realizing that this currency, this value that they're building on these platforms is becoming a sort of a form of capital. And one of the things that we're going to start to see is how people will expect their reputation to become a form of capital that could become more powerful than credit histories over the next 10 to 20 years. So just to wrap, just coming back to brands, the implications are enormous and they're fascinating. Because if you think of companies like Airbnb, you think of all these companies now starting to operate in a decentralized fashion, eBay, Etsy, Dog Vacay, there's hundreds and thousands of them. They have to rely on real individuals delivering their products and services. So from a brand perspective, what's going to start to happen is you have to think about how all those individuals with reputations and profiles start to add or subtract from the company brand in the center. You have to think completely differently about the relationship between the company brand and all the brands of the individuals operating on your marketplace. So what this starts to change for marketers is the 3 fundamental C's, is that we're going to have to think differently about culture. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is how will organizational culture start to inform marketplace or platform culture? So does the fact that Uber have a pretty aggressive corporate culture affect the way those drivers behave on the platform? Does the fact that Airbnb is a really progressive, lovey-dovey culture affect the way hosts behave on the platform? So we're going to see this really interesting intersection between organizational culture and platform culture. The second thing is sort of the next wave of community. I think community is sort of become one of the most overused words in marketing. And yet, for still many brands, it's an add-on. It's something that we think we can create and manage over here, largely through social media. Now, what I see with many of the entrepreneurs in the space is that there is no distinction between community and company. Community is ingrained in their DNA. It's the lens to which they make every single decision about the interaction and touch point with their different consumers. And then the third is consumers. And the interesting thing about consumers is whether that term is actually going to die completely. whether people won't want to be referred to consumers, and whether it's even an accurate description. Because when you zoom out, what happens when you move from a model like this, and you have a producer on one side, and you have a consumer on the other side. So you have a company that creates and produces and distributes goods, and you have consumers that consume them, right? That's the industrial model. They are relatively passive people that you can control the marketing and brand messages around. This is changing. When people talk about empowerment and that the consumer has never been more empowered than ever before, what I think they're actually talking about is that the role of the consumer is changing. That we're no longer passive consumers. We are now lenders, we are now creators, we're now financiers, we're now makers, we're now providers. And that changes the experience we expect to have with companies. So to wrap it up, in this transformation, we are going to see many companies born and many companies die. It's not about slaying giants. It's about thinking about value differently. The one thing I hope you take away with today is that when you're reading about these companies in the press, do not think of this as a tech trend. Do not think of this as a hot startup wave. Think of this as a transformative lens in how you think about assets and creating value, and more importantly, how you think about a massive transformation in the way we think about trust. Now, in this transformation, I promise you, there are tremendous threats, but there are also a huge untapped world of opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank
That was
you.
Fantastic. Quick question for me. There's a lot of marketers here. From a brand's point of view, what's the most scary and at the same time inspiring thing around the collaborative economy?
Loss of control.
Right.
So I think we thought we lost control through social media.
Yeah.
And now we have millions of people that we don't employ essentially controlling the brand experience and hopefully becoming brand advocates for us. But how you let go and how you figure out how you get those people to behave in the right way without some centralized mechanism is absolutely frightening and also very exciting.
Fantastic. Thank
you
you,
very
Rachel.
much.
Rachel Bossman, everyone.